So very pleased to welcome you to this Savvy Talks. Savvy and WFYI have been collaborating for more than 5 years to host these conversations, more than 12 at this point. We use them to inform community conversations about critical issues in Indianapolis and to inform policy and strategic decisions. We're so glad you've joined us today. And now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Jill Sheridan, WFYI's government and policy reporter. Jill?
Thank you, Gail. Such important data that we're going to be talking about today. And we have an excellent lineup of researchers and panelists who will really be digging into this new information, looking at the cradle to prison pipeline. I'd like to introduce both of our panelists today. Rebecca Nannery is a senior research analyst focusing on both quantitative and qualitative research and analysis for several community and community health initiatives. Prior to joining Polis, she served as a research coordinator for the I.E. Richard M. Fairbanks School of Public Health. And all the way from the West Coast, Eric Steiner is creative director of the Spatial History Project at CESTA. He's been at Stanford since 2007, and when he helped co-found the lab that evolved into CESTA. So welcome to both of our presenters today who will get underway with this new data.
Good morning. Thanks for setting aside this time to learn about and discuss equity and the cradle to prison pipeline in Indianapolis. Today's Savvy Talk will demonstrate disparities among different people groups and tell the story of how these can influence people's lives as they grow. Addressing inequities present in our modern day justice system is an important priority for reducing systemic inequality. Imprisonment of its residents impacts our entire community. A child who grows up in a neighborhood where many residents are imprisoned is more likely to become imprisoned themselves and earn less income in adulthood. Their children, in turn, are more likely to grow up in a single-parent household and become imprisoned. A child's social and economic environment influences their life course, but nowhere is this circumstance more apparent than with individuals who cross paths with the criminal justice system as they mature. Economic, racial, and social and educational inequities, all linked to a child's neighborhood, lead too often to a developmental path that moves from cradle to prison. Along the way, these inequities can result in a greater likelihood of school discipline and interaction with the juvenile justice system. Next slide, please. It is well known that racial disparities exist within policing and the jail and prison systems. However, these and other disparities exist long before an individual is imprisoned. When children grow up and the circumstances of their childhood both introduce risk factors that result in greater likelihood of discipline within the school system, more encounters with the juvenile justice system, and in adulthood, greater involvement with the criminal justice system. I will now let my colleague, Eric, explain how where a child is born and the family that they grow up in impact their future behavior and circumstances.
Hi there, thank you, Rebecca. My name is Eric Steiner. I'm a consulting data scientist with the Polis Center. Before I begin, I want to highlight that what you're about to hear in this next section is really considered to be a social science, data-driven kind of analysis. And that I want to highlight comes with its advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of this type of analysis is that it can really lend a large-scale context for trends and can also help identify patterns in data that aren't necessarily evident in everyday experiences, and even help predict future trends. But the disadvantage of this kind of approach is that it can be thought to be too abstract or theoretical rather than solutions-oriented, and it's only as good as the data collected. The other disadvantage of data and statistics is that research has shown that the mere presentation of criminal justice disparities, for example, that Black men are much more likely to be incarcerated than white men, can affect an audience's perception that Black men are innately criminal and make people biased towards policies that motivate policing, such as stop and frisk, that in turn lead to perpetuated disparities. Next slide. A couple of researchers at Stanford University found in a study that, ironically, exposure to extreme racial disparities made the public less and not more responsive to attempts to lessen the severity of policies that maintain these disparities. So this is a really big word of caution, and I know you know this already, but for those of you in the policy arena, you need to be constantly gut checking how evidence might play into your implicit biases. And for those of you in the community or activist arena, this is just a good reminder that if you see policies going in the wrong direction, continue to speak up to highlight these paradoxes. The biases that we have that lead to these perceptions of innate criminality have their basis in some cold, hard facts. That from your first breath, your race and gender, in a sense, predetermine your likelihood of being incarcerated in adulthood. If you grew up in Indianapolis and you were a man, you're 10 times as likely to be incarcerated than if you were a woman, and 6 times more likely if you were Black than if you're white. To take an extreme comparison, Black men are more than 40 times as likely to be incarcerated than white women. There is both an intractability to these huge disparities, they are seemingly fixed, and an opportunity to look more deeply. I think this begins with acknowledging and belaboring these persistent inequities, and it's essential to help reframe the conversation away from these assumptions of innate criminality to address some of the systemic differences across childhood experiences and interaction with the social justice or the criminal justice system. By using data collected by Harvard economist Raj Chetty, we can explore how these patterns of Black-white disparity are actually not fixed, but rather highly variable across space and practically non-existent in some neighborhoods. This begs an important question. What is going on? What is it about certain places that lead to better or worse outcomes for the same kinds of people? And how can we create programs, interventions, and policies that help balance resources and improve these critical conditions? The Opportunity Atlas that I'm highlighting here on this slide is a great resource, and I encourage all of you to use its tools for yourselves. It allows researchers to link childhood conditions, family and neighborhood conditions, directly to outcomes in adulthood. It is one of the largest, if not the largest, longitudinal data set on generational mobility ever collected. Here you can see in the slide the present day incarceration rate for white male children that grew up in all of these communities in the 1980s. That is, the colors on the map highlight which areas, people from which areas ended up being incarcerated as adults, regardless of where they live today. One surprising thing we learned from these data, in particular around white men, was that among the top 50 largest cities in the United States, Indianapolis ranked the worst for rates of white male incarceration. And you can also see just the cluster of highlighted red areas there around Indianapolis. Other mid-sized cities in Indiana had even higher rates for this cohort growing up in the 80s and 90s. On the next slide, you'll see that there's a distinction in racial geography. The pattern for Black men growing up in low-income households is distinctly different. Outcomes for this cohort tended to be worse in northern, mid-sized, predominantly white cities versus predominantly Black cities, namely in the American South. The takeaway from these maps is that place matters, and that the variation in outcomes across a single city, for example, you see here variation across Indianapolis, is as great as the variation as it is across the whole US. When viewed at the neighborhood level, a more nuanced geography emerges, and this begs more questions. What are the key factors that we can take from these data that lead to these patterns? While Chetty's focus has been largely on economic mobility, using his data, we conducted an independent analysis of incarceration and found some key correlates. First, we found that family conditions are critical. This includes, first and foremost, your parents' income. Children growing up in low-income households were 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as adults in high-income households. In addition to parent incomes, intact family units tended to lead to better outcomes. Children growing up in 2-parent households were 1/5 as likely to be incarcerated as single-parent households. And as we've all experienced in some form, there's a multitude of reasons why households are disrupted, from amicable divorce to infidelity to, yes, incarceration and even parent death. 2-parent households, regardless of blood relation, provide a higher chance for increased income, social engagement, presence of role models. It's also important to note that there's nothing particularly special about the 2-parentness of it. The takeaway here is not that family units are particularly important, but there's characteristics of those kinds of relationships that correlate with positive outcomes. And those kinds of environments can be supported through other means. Second, we found that the neighborhood you grow up in makes a big difference independent of other factors. We tested several factors here: median income, median home price, percent poverty level, income inequality, racial segregation, high school dropout rate, a lot of different typical kind of social science variables. The idea here was to look at community spillover effects. What is it about these neighborhoods that might be impacting individuals? And how can we use those to help create better outcomes? 2 key factors stood out here. Fraction college educated. This was a little bit surprising that this was more significant correlate than some of the other factors. We found that children growing up in communities that had a high percentage of residents that were college educated tended to have better outcomes across all race and economic classes. In communities where college education is less common, that pathway to success in turn is less visible and more challenging to blaze. College educated individuals tend to be more engaged with their communities and favor more liberal social policies. Recognizing the importance of college education, it's certainly discouraging that we've seen recently the community college being dropped from the current federal bills. Free community college, that is. Secondly, we found that neighborhood incarceration rates, that is, in the neighborhood you grew up in, for this cohort, we looked at incarceration rates in 1990 and how they affected kids that grew up in those areas. We found that children growing up in those areas tended to have high incarceration rates themselves, regardless of where they ended up as adults. So there's something that gets carried with them. Incarceration affects more than just the individuals who are in jail or prison. It can create long-term collateral consequences by breaking apart families, reducing social integration and stability, and reducing family income potential and thereby intergenerational wealth. Some researchers argue that removing criminals from neighborhoods can actually have a criminogenic effect, resulting in a negative feedback loop for these communities where more crime results. Finally, we also found that other factors were important in early childhood, but it really depends on how you measure them. For example, we found that while neighborhood unemployment rates were not a major factor, whether an individual, him or herself, was employed at age 24 was a very strong correlate. We also know that social capital is important, but we don't have really good measures to track this. Likewise, Rebecca will discuss this further in the next section, we found that some measures of juvenile experience in schools, such as school expenditure, per capita dropout rates, and school quality, showed some weak correlations, but we know schools are a critical piece of this story. Next slide. The key factors listed on the last two slides, household income, family structure, community education, and incarceration rates, are perhaps not surprising, but the leverage that this big data gives us, it has the potential to help us identify opportunities and possibly predict future trends. By looking at the present day conditions, rather than the conditions of the 80s and 90s, as we did to determine these correlations, we can look with moderate confidence towards the future. Here you can see a kind of illustration of that, a map that estimates future incarceration rates for children growing up in Indiana counties based on these recent conditions in those areas. Imagine, if you will, the potential of extending this down to the neighborhood level. This kind of predictive quantitative approach does have some potential, but breaking the pattern of juvenile detention and adult incarceration really means teasing out the underlying mechanisms behind these correlations to help children get better outcomes. One way to start doing this is to see how neighborhood and individual factors intersect in different kinds of neighborhoods. Next slide. It gets really complicated really quickly, but a basic comparison of different neighborhood income levels by their racial composition shows some interesting patterns. The first takeaway from this graph is that you can see that Black children tend to have a positive effect of growing up in middle and high income neighborhoods. So the blue lines are Black children. On the left side of each of those graphs is neighborhoods that are mostly Black. On the right side is mostly white. So you can see overall Black children tend to have a positive effect. This is the same cohort. This is low income Black children, or in this case, Black males. Same income class, but different neighborhood. And you can see there's a positive effect, lower incarceration rates as you move into higher income neighborhoods. This is particularly true in middle and high income Black neighborhoods. They have even more positive influence. Meanwhile, while incarcerations for white men are lower across the board, they also tend to be incarcerated at higher rates in mostly Black communities, regardless of the median income of those neighborhoods. So there isn't as much of a positive effect of growing up in a different kind of neighborhood, a wealthier neighborhood, so to speak, for the white population. Next slide. Finally, if you look at the same trends for children growing up in high income families, you can see the trends go in the same direction. There's this kind of opposite effect. But there are two notable conclusions here. First, except for in the wealthiest neighborhoods, it's important to recognize again that high income Black men tend to be incarcerated at rates above those of low income white men. So there's a really significant disparity there. And second, the positive neighborhood effect for Black men, that is how much of an advantage there is to grow up in a higher income neighborhood, is comparable to simply being born into a higher income family. So we know neighborhood is playing a big role. This is not at all a simple story, and we know that challenging conditions that affect neighborhoods are really intercorrelated. They pile on to one another: housing, poverty, unemployment, et cetera, and eventually add up to an economic, social, and psychological context that makes it incredibly difficult for people growing up in these communities to overcome this adversity. I'll now turn it over to Rebecca to touch on this complexity and follow our pipeline through adolescence.
Thank you, Eric. I want to take the conversation back to the individual level and speak briefly about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. These are account of different traumatic events that occur in childhood and can include abuse, neglect, lack of a strong emotional support system, and poor parental mental health or parental imprisonment. Exposure to violence and poor social capital in one's neighborhood are also potential ACEs. Children who experience ACEs are more likely to have behavioral and mental health challenges, adopt risky behaviors, and have poor physical and mental health outcomes into adulthood. These are all more also more likely to be imprisoned as adults, among whom one study found had 4 times the number of ACEs of the adult male population that was not imprisoned. I will now shift to the next segment of the pipeline, which is disciplinary action in schools. School discipline policies can directly or indirectly put affected students into contact with the juvenile or adult justice systems. They can also academically marginalize students. Removing children from school for even a few days disrupts their education and can provide opportunities for them to get in trouble. Studies have shown a child who has been suspended is more likely to be retained in grade, drop out, commit a crime, and be imprisoned as an adult. Where did these school discipline policies come from? In the 1990s, zero tolerance policies led to the escalation of consequences for students who committed minor infractions in schools. The Gun-Free Schools Act of 1994 enacted mandatory expulsions and law enforcement referrals for firearm activity in and around schools. However, the act later expanded these punishments to apply to other kinds of weapons and to include various behavioral issues, including alcohol and drugs, fighting, threatening behavior, and disruption. As a result, the lines between school disciplinary action and police involvement were blurred. Across Indiana, the most common type of school discipline experienced by students is suspension. In the 2019 to 2020 school year, 4% of Hoosier students from kindergarten to 12th grade had received an in-school suspension, while 5% had an out-of-school suspension. Expulsions from school are rare. We will now discuss school district level disciplinary data in Marion County during the 2019 to 2020 school year. Lawrence, Wayne, and Perry townships have the highest in-school suspension rates. For out-of-school suspensions, the highest rates are in Indianapolis Public Schools and Warren Township. When data on in-school suspensions is examined by race and ethnicity, Black students have the highest suspension rates across the board among these school districts for which there is data. Perry Township in particular leads the other districts in school suspensions, and more than twice as many Black students face in-school suspensions there than either white or Hispanic or Latino students. Some of these racial and ethnic disparities are even greater when we look at out-of-school suspension data. These rates for Black students are far greater than for white or Hispanic or Latino students. In Indianapolis public schools, these rates are nearly 4 times greater. The data does indicate that some schools tend to mete out of-school suspensions more often, while others appear to have the capacity to offer in-school suspension to more students. Other disparities also exist among students with different situations. Students with disabilities, such as emotional disturbances or intellectual disabilities, are suspended at higher rates than other students. Additionally, students receiving a free or reduced lunch are more likely to be suspended than students who do not receive a free or reduced lunch. We will now shift to the next piece of the pipeline and discuss juvenile crime in Indianapolis. Children and youth ages 5 to 17, who are referred to as juveniles in the justice context, may also directly interact with the criminal justice system when they are arrested and charged for crimes. After increasing during the 1990s, the number of juvenile charges in Indianapolis reached a high of nearly 18,000 charges in 2004, but sharply declined from 2008 to the present day by a whopping 90%. This decline is attributable in part to the 2006 implementation of the Evidence-Based Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative in Marion County, which marked a change from a juvenile detention-based approach to provision of community program alternatives designed to keep juveniles out of the juvenile justice system. In 2020, approximately 2,000 juvenile charges were made in connection with crimes in Indianapolis. Many of the arrests associated with these charges took place in downtown and in the Martindale-Brightwood neighborhood stretching northeast, and in the Castleton Square Mall area. While the annual number of juvenile charges in Indianapolis decreased drastically in recent years, this did not occur proportionately among racial and ethnic groups. The present day outcome is still not proportionate among racial and ethnic groups. In 2020, a Black youth is 5 times more likely to be charged with a crime than a white youth. Likewise, a Hispanic or Latino youth was twice as likely to be charged in 2020. In Indiana, the 3-year juvenile recidivism rate is 29%, making it likely that youth who offend will offend again as adults. Now I will hand it over again to Eric, who will discuss the final destination of the pipeline, jail and prison.
In this section, we want to look at some of the top level trends in jail and prison rates as they stand today. Recent trends show that there has been some good progress. Incarceration rates in urban areas across the country and in Indiana have fallen steadily since 2005. Reforms such as pretrial diversion programs, risk assessments, or reduced penalties have made an impact on overall incarceration rates, both in jail and prison, but mostly in urban areas. Rural jails are substantially overcrowded and have continued to increase steadily. Aside from, please stay on the last slide. Aside from potential changes in rates of crime, some of this can be attributed to an increase in people being held before trial and an increase in people being transferred from other authorities. So you can see the Indiana rate there at the top. So we've seen this, in this case, we're looking at Marion County versus the whole state. If you parse this out by areas that are suburban or mid-sized areas or rural, you'll see a pretty steady increase over time in jail rates. Really, the decrease is strongly in Marion County and urban areas. The similar pattern is true in many other states. On the next slide, we'll look at the disparities between the Black and white incarceration rates. They have also declined. This disparity has also declined sharply recently during this period, but it's leveled off and reached a kind of steady state of roughly 3-to-1 ratio. White incarceration rates continue to climb steadily in rural areas, and you can see this evidenced by that dotted yellow line near the bottom. You can see a continual increase in white incarceration rates, particularly outside the urban context. The reasons for this are not well understood, but a couple possibilities are that this is due to the increase in opioid addiction and related offenses, but also possibly due to the misidentification of Hispanic and Latinos as white offenders. If we look at imprisonment rates, while the imprisonment rates are similar, on the next slide, you'll see a similar pattern where we've seen a decline since the mid-2000s. And we see that is more sharp in Marion County relative to the state overall. The relationship between jail and prison numbers has grown more complex in recent years. Diversion programs can keep people in jail instead of prison. Sentencing officers can choose to send inmates to jail rather than prison. And there's recent laws that route parole offenders back to jail instead of returning to prison. And this has all contributed to a circumstance in which jails are now accounting for some of this decline in prison populations. For more information on the jail and prison trends, please check out the Vera Institute reports. They highlight some of these dynamics, including how jails have become a county revenue stream in some of these rural areas.
I've already mentioned the community-based juvenile detention alternatives initiative that drastically reduced the number of charges through the juvenile justice system in Marion County. Now I will discuss some evidence-based approaches to intervening among children so they are less likely to be drawn into the cradle to prison pipeline. Zero tolerance approaches to school discipline significantly enhance the rates of suspensions and expulsions while ignoring the root cause of behaviors. Alternatives to suspensions include utilizing evidence-based frameworks such as positive behavioral interventions and supports. These preventative approaches address the underlying cause or purpose of the behavior and reinforce positive behaviors. Interventions utilizing this approach have been shown to reduce student behavioral problems, bullying, and substance abuse. They improve student academic performance and socio-emotional competence, and they increase a sense of efficacy and safety among teachers. Another approach to addressing the needs of children and youth is restorative justice, which creates a safe place for an accused child and those they affected to make amends with each other. While zero tolerance discipline approaches focus on punishment, restorative justice highlights the opportunity for prevention and intervention to address the root causes of behavior. Restorative justice views harm as a fracturing of relationships rather than something that demands punishment. A restorative justice process is a way to uncover actual needs and heal relationships via meaningful accountability. Restorative approaches allow the impacted parties to talk about what happened, how they are feeling, its impact, and what can be done to make it right. Ideally, a plan to address the harm includes a path to repair the relationship and rebuild the community. Between 2009 and 2018, students of color became the majority of public school students. Yet nationally, 4 out of 5 public school teachers identify as white and non-Hispanic. This gap in race and ethnicity between students and teachers necessitates addressing implicit bias to ensure racially and culturally sensitive approaches in the classroom and beyond. Implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that can unconsciously affect understanding, actions, and decisions. Understanding implicit bias can help better understand how institutional racism and other forms of bias impact educational alternatives. By utilizing these practices in schools, students learn valuable social and emotional skills such as patience, empathy, active listening, and impulse control. These social and emotional skills are critical in overcoming adverse childhood experiences to develop our communities into places focused on healing and breaking the cycle of the cradle to prison pipeline. Positive reinforcement for constructive child and youth behavior emphasizes prevention rather than punishment and attempts to interrupt the pipeline by getting to root causes of childhood behavior. Addressing the underlying institutional racism and classism in education and broadly in our society is essential to dismantling the pipeline further. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca and Eric. Hugely important information as we're considering so many issues facing us here in Indianapolis and around the country. We did have some questions in, and I do want to ask that anyone who has a question, please do enter that in the Q&A, and we will try to answer everyone's questions, whether online or verbally during the panel discussion as well. We want to take a little bit of time to answer questions with Eric and Rebecca about the data. I know there was a lot of information that built on another report that we had done a while ago about income, opportunity, and inequality. Eric, if I could maybe ask you, how, when we're looking at this data, does that information really come through when we're considering poverty as a factor, as a major factor to whether or not somebody ends up involved in the criminal justice system?
Poverty is certainly a critical factor, and I think, as you could see, there's an important element to the kind of household that you're born into, as well as a neighborhood effect. And so one of the questions that came up in the Q&A was just thinking about the role of apparent income versus your race. I think it's critical to think about this because it does seem like there is an intergenerational issue here where income is not getting passed on to a second generation in Black communities. And so the effect of being a high income, growing up in a high income household in a Black community means that you're still incarcerated continue to be incarcerated at a really high rate. The advantage of moving into or growing up in a higher income neighborhood seems to have a really positive effect. Interestingly, the raw poverty level in a neighborhood does not statistically correlate very well, but the conditions that surround it, maybe social capital and programs and social engagement, may correlate with that in ways that show the advantage of moving into other kinds of communities.
Rebecca, you talked about how the numbers of incarceration rates have declined across the board in Indiana, specifically in Marion County. Would that lead someone to believe that we're making some moves in the right direction with reform?
Absolutely. A 90% decline is huge.
Right.
And I think that goes to show that how important it is to reach out to young people and provide them with support in their communities. It's absolutely essential, and I don't think that such a large decline could happen without a drastic change in the system using an evidence-based approach.
Something that stuck out to me during the report is really the influence of incarceration on a community. So saying that, if this is more prevalent in a neighborhood, it's almost contagious. Eric, could you comment on those findings as it relates to the report? I mean, it looked like it was a pretty significant factor.
Yeah, that's right. When we did these correlations, we looked at these terms may not mean a lot to everybody, but we looked at the census tract level, the county level, and the commuting zone level, which essentially correlates to the city level. And we found that incarceration rates were significantly correlated at all of those levels. That is to say that there is a really strong relationship between kind of repeating pattern of incarceration rate in community. And again, the kind of follow-on effect of incarceration is not just the impact that it has on those individuals. One side of the debate would say, well, if you remove criminals from a community, then you have a community that has fewer offenders and has potentially a more positive environment to grow up in. But those effects that I mentioned, the removal of individuals from households, so you end up with more single parent family units. This issue of removing income potential from families is really critical, as we've seen the relationship between income and incarceration rate. Also, the importance of just social integration and then exposure to role models is really important. There's also the issue of when criminals come back into communities. It's pretty common for offenders to be to return back into those communities after being incarcerated. So there's this kind of pattern of disrupted social networks and a kind of lack of stability as people are coming and going in these environments. So I think that's some of the root drivers behind that, and something that seem to correlate well across all geographies.
We do have a question in the Q&A, and again, anyone online today is welcome to submit a question. A lot of questions about if the slides will be available. Yes, they will be. After this presentation, we will tell you exactly how to get those slides. But a Child Care Answers has a question about a child care. Is the data included here? What does that look like in terms of young children ages 0 to 5 in childcare? What can parents do to support, and what can child providers do as well? Do we have any information there?
This isn't something that we specifically looked at in the data, but the fact that as soon as you're born, you can be impacted by different factors around you. It's important to provide young children, especially with the social and emotional supports that they need to flourish later in life. I know even I used to say children are really resilient. And yes, they are, but no, they aren't, because they truly are impacted by the experiences that they face, even when they're babies. Babies who aren't shown affection, when they're first born, they end up having emotional difficulties later and trouble attaching with other people. So it's truly important to provide the same supports that you provide an older child in a age-appropriate fashion for younger children.
And building off that, I mean, maybe would it be helpful if more groups, including child cares and other groups, track those ACEs? I mean, it's a pretty simple process to find out exactly how children have been impacted.
Absolutely. And this is a tool that some social workers and others, maybe even schools, might use.
And we're seeing some questions from an intersectional lens. Asks Laura, what data are we seeing for the experience of Black girls and women in the report here?
I wish I could speak cogently on that topic. Unfortunately, the data are very sparse. The rates are very low, and so it's hard to find statistical patterns in the data because there's so low numbers. But maybe someone can speak more experientially on that matter.
We will be getting into all these issues again as we go into the panel discussion. I would like to ask one more question based, on this report here, and as this issue is so highlighted in our brains in this past year, bias on the part of the police and the court system contributing to higher rates of custodial sentences, asks Sue, for Black men than other groups. Do we have any data in this report that really points to the actions of law enforcement and the court system?
We don't in this report. However, we do have a past post about this topic on savvy.org. And we're also in the future going to be exploring jail diversion, looking at jail data to understand patterns there in terms of sentencing and what impact that may have on different racial groups.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Eric, for all the work, for this report that will be, again, accessible to anyone who's interested in digging into this issue a little bit deeper, this issue that obviously touches all impacts, all facets of somebody's life growing up here in Indianapolis or anywhere really. It's an American problem. Thank you both. And we'd like to invite in now our panel discussion, again, open to anyone who would be interested in questions. We've got answers. We have a great panel joining us today. First, I'd like to introduce James Wilson. He's the founder and the CEO of Circle Up Indy. He's a native of the Martindale-Brightwood area on the east side of Indianapolis. James, true testament of how one can turn their life around regardless of their past. Circle Up Indy's focus is a socioeconomic evolution, community development, engagement, housing, and community self-stability. Hi, James. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Jill. Thank you.
Next on our panel today, Greg Kiesling. He's a leader in workforce development in Indianapolis for over 25 years. He's the founder and CEO of nonprofit electronic recycling social enterprise, RecycleForce, and also the alternative staffing social enterprise group, Keys to Work. Both organizations, long time supporting returning citizens, providing employment, skill acquisition, assisting clients with management of criminal justice mandates placed on returning citizens through the court. Good morning, Greg. Welcome.
Morning, Jill.
Also with us today, Reverend Shonda Nicole, founder of Good to the Soul, a social enterprise that energizes individuals and institutions to flourish and do good, especially good that promotes the spirit of universal liberation. Thank you, Reverend Shonda, for being here today.
Thank you so much.
And also with us this morning on our panel, Rosie Bryant, who is a community organizer with Faith in Indiana. At Faith in Indiana, Rosie leads the valued Live Free Work, which focuses on police accountability, reducing gun violence and mass incarceration. Outside of the office, Rosie serves on a number of boards. She's also the Young Adult Network Coordinator for Crossroads at AMA Church and facilitates various youth-led projects, working with a lot of youth in our city here. Good morning, Rosie. How are you?
Good morning. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you again, all of you, for being here to discuss this important information. Maybe if we could just go around quickly and sort of talk about how your group, the work that your group does intersect this information. James, we'll start with you.
Good morning to everyone. The work that we do and the information that was provided today highly affects the community we serve in Martindale Brightwood, from education purposes, incarceration, from food distribution, every factor of disparity that exists, and even from housing.
And Greg, obviously, you know, your work directly is impacting this. What do you, what sort of, what do you think when you hear these findings?
Well, certainly it tracks for very closely along our 25 years of experience with the big spike when we came to Indianapolis in '96, and things that we were doing was called hug-a-thug, you know, where people were just going in. But it has got appreciably better in the last few years, especially under our current prosecutor. The court system in Marion County is the best it's ever been. The labor market for hiring felons, you know, people coming home from prison, is the best it's ever been. Yet there are still a lot of disparities around housing and mental health services and the things that people need when they come home. One of the things that we've learned around ACEs and, you know, the impact when people go to prison, nobody, no matter your race, gets better inside a steel and concrete box. And when people come home, which almost all do, 97% of everybody that goes in comes home. And 70% or so come out in the first 2 years after incarceration. So it is really needed for services in the community to help connect people with meaningful work, their children, and opportunities to rebuild their lives. And never in our 25 years has this population been needed more to grow our economy and our activities in Marion County and surrounding counties.
Reverend Shonda, what do you see in intersecting the work that you do with the data that we're looking at today?
Yeah, thanks so much. Good to the soul, again, good to the spirit of universal liberation. We really take seriously that quote by Maya Angelou, which is, the truth is no one of us can be free until all of us are free. And so, of course, there are reasons that incarceration is important for some segments of the population at times. But the reality of the data suggests that it is utilized far more frequently and sometimes unnecessarily, causing disruptions to families and really the crippling effect of no longer allowing for there to be freedom and wholeness and fullness of important members of our community. And so we believe, and good to the soul, of helping provide culturally intuitive consultation to community institutions to assist them and to encourage individuals and institutions themselves to lean into how can we make the most faithful steps towards freedom, wholeness, and fullness for individuals as well as for the community at large. So the data was very helpful. And I'm looking forward to this conversation with my fellow panelists.
And Rosie, I know you and your group, Faith in Indiana, have long been at this advocacy work as it relates to especially mass incarceration. What are you thinking when you hear a presentation like this today?
When I hear this presentation, I emphasize more the need for community organizing in this work, because direct services are good, like Greg mentioned. People need those services. People need to get a job, they need housing, but we also have to address the policies that allow these things to happen. Studies show that actually people who are more politically active in their community have more pride about their community and are tend to do better long term, right? And so understanding how the political process works is very helpful. Some of our work that we've done that has led to some success in the decline in incarceration rates in Marion County is the MCAT strategy. Because most of the people in our jails, I'm talking about 90% of them, are either dealing with mental illness and or addiction and don't even belong in our jail system. So why are we putting them there? If our communities were safer because we had more police and putting more people in jail was the solution, then we should have been safe already, because they've been doing this for decades and our community is still not safe. So that's not the answer.
Well, the answer, I think a lot of people here are fully aware, it has to involve mental health. It has to involve trauma-informed solutions. We have to have more of that. And yet, we don't often see the funding coming towards that. We often don't see real commitment to those solutions when we're looking at the big picture. I know, Greg, your group has made that more of a priority as you're moving forward in recent. And
to build on what Rosie was saying, and to remind everybody that's listening today, people that have a felony conviction in Indiana can vote. The only time they cannot vote is if they're in jail or in prison at the time of the election. But whether you're on probation, community correction, parole, you can vote. And I know Rosie and everybody on this panel has worked hard to get people to get out to vote, but that's really our big step, to be able to get these services so they come. Marion County is a dot surrounded by other counties that have quite different policies and quite a bit of influence on what happens in our county at the state level. Yet many of these districts with redistricting now are kind of snaking through. There are tremendous opportunities to change that narrative by just getting people to vote and become active so that these services can come. Recycle Force, for instance, gets direct federal funding. Very few groups across the state do this around what is called REO, or the USDOL's reentry employment opportunities. So I just think there's so many things that we could do as we get our elected leaders, not only in Marion County, right? Because I think Marion County is leading in a really good way in these issues, but in our surrounding counties. I'll say that economic development and workforce development happen in regions, but reentry in our prison system and our mental health system are in county systems. So it's very difficult to move in housing. And if somebody wants to live in Boone County because they have a job out there, it's hard to do if you have a conviction in Marion County. You have to get permission from the multiple counties. So we're hoping we can begin to look at regionalization of these issues that impact well-being and healthy living, so they go across the regions and not just county by county.
James, I might ask you a question. Again, if anyone has questions, please enter them in the Q&A box for our panelists today. Dejan asked, I don't think the report really touches a ton on this, but when we're trying to unearth the historical disadvantage of Black people economically, we know there, again, policies that have been placed for decades and decades have impacted neighborhoods across Indianapolis. But what do you think about the work that you're doing so that people can really understand that Black people, many are in poverty, but the historical aspect of that.
I love the historical piece. Those who work with me always know I always look at the root causes of why everything exists. With all the data, all the information from the panelists, everybody has all the expertise, the experiences, so on and so forth. But the piece that Mr. Washington asks is about the historical stance. If you look at the historical stance, it takes you back, right? And when you go back, you have to look at the root causes, why it then became historical. And so the problem being is that things are not properly addressed in the Black, brown communities or even underpowered communities. It's tapped. We keep doing the change thing, right? When I speak on change in the sense that, again, it can be regressive or progressive. It can move forward or it can go backwards. Our goal today with Circle Up is to move everything forward, hence evolution. You hear me preach on evolution so much. And the beauty and the reason why I preach that, because I love things moving forward. I don't like to go back. George Washington, our very first president, once said, only time to look in the past is to derive useful lessons for the future. And that means he went back to look at the root cause in order to build out for the future. Economically speaking, that's what Circle Up is pushing towards. We're looking to build community wealth, simply put. And in order to stop the violence, all these great things, even the mental health factors and drug addiction, it all has a root cause. I didn't wake up one day just saying, hey, look, I'm going to use drugs for the rest of my life. I didn't wake up one day saying psychologically, I'm not going to really be focused mentally to really, go out there and sustain. There's factors that was put in place for individuals over the years, be it that the socioeconomic trauma, right? And that's the root cause of what individuals go through. When you look at socioeconomic trauma, it looks at from the time you're born. If I'm born in a level of struggle and survival, my mind's not going to fully develop or even fully cope what life really is. And so if we look at the root causes to put more investments directly back into our people and our community, you will start to minimize strong mental health issues. You'll start to minimize strong addiction issues because now there's a wraparound support and understanding and development.
Question for Rosie, sort of building off the mental health issue that you had mentioned. Interventions, any thoughts on interventions for people that are impacted by the prison pipeline? Are there any current programs, again, solutions that have shown to be successful in your experience?
Yes, so the MCAT strategy that I mentioned before that we advocated for, what it does is anytime, it was piloted on the Near East Side when we first advocated for this strategy. And anytime someone comes in contact with police that's dealing with addiction or mental illness, instead of sending them to prison, they send them to a treatment center. What that did was it had a 90% reduction in arrest rates. And then our mayor, because of our work, decided this worked so well, and because we advocated for it, he added more, I'm talking about millions of dollars into this strategy to advance it across Indianapolis. Now, mental illness is a multifaceted issue, and just sending someone to treatment is not gonna just all of a sudden magically make their troubles all go away. It's a long process, right? As a licensed social worker and as someone who has counseled people dealing with addiction and mental illnesses, it's a process that you have to really walk someone through. So having a therapist is helpful as they're struggling with it, because oftentimes people who are dealing with addiction, normally, like James says, there's some root causes, and some of that is family dynamics. Growing up in a home that has high poverty rates, growing up in a home where there's only one parent or guardian in the home plays a role in that. Growing up in a home, let's just talk about, actually for Black people, seeing the constant violence on our people, that's a stressor. Every time we read the news, someone is being killed and hurt and harmed, and then our country is saying, oh, that's not true, racism doesn't exist. That is difficult to deal with, and it's traumatizing, right? And so all of these factors play a huge role into dealing with someone, helping someone dealing with addiction.
Reverend Shonda, we've had a number of questions that are sort of building off of some information from the report. One of the big factors, single family households, single guardian homes what types of interventions, what types of recommendations there? I mean, it's not, go find a new husband. What institutions do you see as being, factors addressing that disparity when we're talking about a whole family?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. I'm thinking a little more broadly. There's a popular marketing campaign out that talks about widening the screen, a fuller view of Black life. And I want to invite us to imagine a fuller view of parental life that doesn't see single or multiple guardians as a deficit, but it really is not the number of parents, but the quality of parents. What is the level of education that one's parent is able to attain? What are the kinds of wages that a parent is able to bring into the household? And the ways that ability to earn, ability to be educated, and then ability to have a community that is rearing that child. Growing up and all throughout my pastoral work, we talk about it taking a village to raise a child. The number of parents in a household doesn't need to negatively impact the child or the children if it is a quality household that is flourishing because there are others in the community who see something, say something, and do something. It can take all of us being present to a family that is in need as a potential intervention. Again, I'm an associate pastor of a church. Churches are great institutions for us to utilize. Some people don't feel like God things are their thing. And so we have community organizations. There are fraternities and sororities, particularly in the Black Panhellenic Council. I'm a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. And our sorority, we love being part of families that don't necessarily have all of the numbers that make it what the society would consider a healthy family. But because of our presence as a community, we certainly contribute to the health and stability of families in general.
I love that. Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, I just want to add to this idea of two-generation approach.
Yeah.
When one of the faults I hear in my community, especially, or the leaders in the foundation world that are trying to address these issues, I'll often hear people say, we have to save the children. The adults are lost causes. And I was recently at a big event where that was said publicly, and I was like, oh. But I think by helping the parent who has made the mistake come home and find stability is the most important way we help the children, one of the most important ways we help the children. So it's this idea of two-generation. It means many things to many people, but I hope at some level we put the idea of helping both generations. And maybe it fits into what the Reverend is saying here about having multiple people in the community that are involved, and grandparents and aunties and uncles. But certainly the incarcerated parent, when they come home, if we give them a fighting chance to succeed, it's probably in our work, we see it as one of the best ways to help the children find some amount of stability. And for those of you old like me, you become your parents. If you don't know that, we all turn into our parents.
Greg,
dad now.
Well, thank you for saying that. In our community, we have a father who's just returned. He'd been incarcerated for 4 of the 6 years of his daughter's life. And during the 4 years that he was incarcerated, his mother did a great job of being present with that baby girl. But if you could see the change in her little light as she's seen daddy come home, and daddy is working hard. He's gone to the motor vehicle department to get his identification so he can become employed. It hasn't been easy, but because he's had people who were waiting for him to come home and have things set up for him to be able to re-enter well, the baby girl is seeing a change. And we're hopeful that this work is going to make a difference in the life of our 3 members of one family in our community.
Well said.
Go ahead, James. It looked like you wanted to maybe weigh in. I mean, it's the whole family is really important. I know many community centers do a 2-generational approach, but the whole, how important is that?
I think it's extremely important. Growing up with a single mother, with a mother that is a single parent, and raising multiple kids, it's not always easy, because it goes back to what Reverend Gladden stated, that the community village feel, everybody's inclusive and everybody raised you. Even though my mom raised us by ourselves, we still had that family feel and village within the community. A lot has changed, so we have to go back again. How do we keep that still going? If our community is shifting and changing the dynamics, there will be no village anymore because the community is in fact shifting. So let's go back again. We need to do, looking at the root cause, go back, right? How do we stabilize our community to bring that village change? Because we can preach it all day, but if Rosie lived down the street and Rosie does not have a level of stability, and Greg doesn't have a level of stability, and they move out that neighborhood, guess what? It creates a whole new mechanism of rotation. Again, stabilize the community, you stabilize the family. You start to build with the family as they start to know and work with one another.
Yeah, Rosie, would you like to weigh in on that? I mean, it is so important that the community is stable, but I know it's a struggle sometimes to get the community involved in these issues, to turn around feelings about what's happening.
I think oftentimes people are not talking to them about what they care about. They're coming in with an agenda already, and they want them to come aligned to their agenda, versus we just had a community meeting where we had 42 people. My focus area is gun violence reduction, police reform, and mass incarceration. This particular group wanted to focus on education. I was like, okay, so, now I have to switch, right? That's my focus and that's my agenda. However, that's not an area that didn't come up for them as much. And so we have to learn to listen to them. Coming from, I had my first child at the age of 15. And then by the age of 18, I had 3 children. And I was a single mother for a very long time. And one of the things that impacted me in my development wasn't just because I got a job that paid well. It was, I was able to go to college and someone actually invested the time in me to make me understand that I could actually do it. In school, and I went to public school, I was the child that was left behind. I struggled academically because I did not believe that I could actually understand the material. I thought something was wrong with me and I was dumb, I was stupid, I didn't get it, right? Those are the things that I told myself. Someone took the time, that someone was actually my youngest daughter's father, to invest in me because he came from a different background where education was actually expected in his household. It was the standard. And so he knew that, and I didn't have that experience. I honestly didn't even know that there were Black families that had doctors and lawyers. I didn't have those examples in my community, right? And so once I was able to see that this was possible, I was able to move forward. And then I started to create this community of love and support. Our youngest daughter has so many people around her in her life that support of her adventures. She can reach out to all of them. Reverend Gladden is one of them, and many others in the community that help support her to be her best self, right? And because when we really truly say it takes a community to raise a child, it's true. It's really true. What James and Reverend Gladden said is true. When we have multiple people cultivating those relationships, listening to people about what they care about, and cultivating that, and helping them to be successful in whatever they feel like success is not just about making a bunch of money. Success is based on what the person wants and their goals. And so all of that can create a stable community.
I'm talking about schools. I mean, there's some really interesting information in the report as it relates to, in school, out of school suspension. And I know that there's a lot of data that just goes to show, the discipline that a Black child might face versus a white child is very impactful and leads us through this pipeline. Was there anything, I guess, James, maybe I'll turn to you, when we are considering schools? I mean, again, place matters, and a lot of people may not have the opportunity or even just the opportunity to find that education for their families. But when we're considering, the pipeline.
It very much so. Growing up, I mean, my mom always emphasized education, but it goes back to what Rosie said. I didn't really see too many, Black lawyers or anybody that comes from where I come from to raise success, right? And so when you get younger individuals like myself, young Black men, or even some Black women for that matter, that don't see individuals like themselves successful and come from where they come from. When they go to school, it's hard for them to really adapt, because in their psychologically, they're always told in the community and from the level of suppression that exists, you're not going to really make it. You're not going to really go nowhere. This is what it is. And so we can't get content with that no more. Like Rosie stated, in order for me to grow to where I'm at now, I never had anybody really invest in me. She had someone invest in her after she went through struggle. Me, I went to prison at 17. I came home at 26. Nobody didn't really invest in me. What first thing that came out was, you're young, you got dreads, you got a criminal history, so on and so forth. That followed me so hard. And some of it still follow me till this day. Being a young Black male, living that experience each and every day. Trying to build with the work that we do with our organization. That's why we connect directly to the people, because we understand it. You can't build for something that you don't understand. So a lot of cats in school, they don't feel like they're really understood and valued as much anymore. And so when they don't have that form of investing for it and so on, you're going to get unnecessary behaviors. But the school system, some school systems, I can't say all, some school systems now automatic, they went back to the 90s and the early 2000s. Remember, let's expel, let's suspend, and let's arrest. And so that's not the way to solve it anymore. Let's put strong substances in play to really help not just support the student, but support the family. Because if that student having problems in school, you got to go back again to look at the root cause of what's going on at home.
Yeah, maybe Reverend Shonda, I would ask you to weigh in on that, the discipline that a child and the disparity that a child may face with discipline in mind in a school. I know you work with a lot of youth. Is it something that you see really impacting young people?
I do, and thank you again for that question, particularly, and it goes back to what perhaps a comment was made in the chat or in the Q&A, the question around Black girls in particular. One of my passions is addressing the adultification bias and the ways that the N.E.E. Casey Foundation's report talked about girlhood being interrupted, that so many times in the school system, Black girls especially are seen as much older than they actually are. I volunteer in my son's school at least once a week, and what I see is that these girls who are 13, 14, and 15 are seen because they're physically developed, their maturity in terms of their conversation, they take up all of the space. They are very loud most of the times because it is a Black girl's providence and a Black girl's prerogative to own all of her space. And so I applaud it. But many times that is seen as very negative. It is seen as this is a child who is defiant. It is a child who is abrasive and aggressive and brash, and therefore needs to be disciplined into conformity. When in reality, again, if we widen the screen, if we would see in different cultures that are not Western, if we were to travel across the river, that we would see in Black and brown communities that are on the continent, that loudness is not something that is to be tempered or tamed, but that we ought to own all of our voice, all of our space, and experience it as a joyful abundance of Black joy and Black confidence. But something happens here in this Western world. I don't know if it's the plantation politics that are reemerging from what the antebellum South intended for Black and brown bodies to do and to be, that they're told to be quiet. Shh, you'll get in trouble if you speak. And not only if you speak, but if you speak louder than is anticipated from those who are around you in authority. So we really have to take a look at the norms and the expectations and the mores that are very whitewashed, that are very dominant focused and very Western centric, that are not healthy, whole, or life-giving for Black and brown youth. And that leads to the means of, what are we calling, suspensions, as well as the chastisement. What are we calling it when a child is disciplined in school?
And your words make me think of the podcast, shameless plug for our colleagues over at Side Effects Sick, but a young woman that should not have been in prison, being killed in prison, a young woman that was maybe louder than she should have been, but should have never been in prison and should have gotten mental health help and did not, and died. And
I think of my young AME sister, Sandra Bland, who was driving to a new job in Texas, pulled over and was defiant towards the police officer who should not have been taken to jail in Waller County because she failed to signal, but ended up dead suggested to be a suicide, when we know in reality, again, I know her pastor. I know her family that was raised in our AME church in DuPage, Illinois. This was not a woman who was defiant and aggressive. Maybe she was in that moment because she was having a rough morning, but should she have been dead? I don't think so.
I think, if I may, Jill.
Please, yes.
I love Reverend Gladden's outline and what you're hitting on. I appreciate that so much, because what she just outlined was understanding of the Black culture. It's really understanding how we integrate, how we talk, and how we discuss. For instance, about a month ago, I was pulled over by IMPD. A lot of times we get so agitated and we get so tight because it's trauma. Looking back at the 60s to now, what happened when law enforcement integrated and engaged with Black folk? If anybody care to deny it, history's right there. Go watch the videos when we sprayed with water hose, when we was beating dog sick to illness. So when we still have that generationally moving forward, it's not always easy for us to, properly engage, or we get tight and we get tense and scared. But in this situation, when an officer engaged, we went about it. Yeah, was I a little tight? Absolutely. Because in my mind, I don't know his intent when you get pulled over by 3 officers all simultaneously, right? So we don't know what's going to happen, because it could have been a situation with Ms. Bland. I could have been injured or hurt for that matter. So it's understanding, more importantly, the culture that you're trying to be a part of, represent, or develop. That is very, very important.
And during this past year, we've heard so much, about the bias, the implicit bias in our legal system and with law enforcement. Something that we're getting questions about here in the Q&A. It's clear, the numbers are clear, the data is not lying. What should be done to address this bias that, we've seen again and again in our law enforcement system here in Indianapolis? We give some lip service sometimes, but what real actions?
I'm sorry,
go ahead, Rose. No, go, Rosie, go.
On our amazing organizing work. And as a woman who, I'm trying not to curse on this call, who takes up a lot of space and talks very loud and intentional in spaces so that we can get what we want. We won the first ever co-governance board that allows citizens to sit on that board and make our police department's policy. And now we are holding a briefing next Tuesday at 6:30 online, where we're going to talk about some of the policies that we want this GO board to implement. And those citizens that are on the board are citizens. One of them is one of the pastors that helped us win that. And then the other two are some allies that we've worked with in the community that's going to introduce this board. And guess what? We have so much power on that board, the police department can't do anything about it, because we make that happen. And because I, as a woman, as a Black woman, stood in a space and decided that I no longer wanted my Black men to be killed. And I'm also not going to be quiet about it. And I am angry. I am a mad Black woman, as I should be, because you continue to take our Black men from us. And then you tell us that the solution to our problems is to go get a man and to go get married. 1, you don't even know if I like men. 2, you're taking all of our men. So let's talk about that.
Greg, you wanted to weigh in on this?
Well, for the Caucasian community, for those listening out here, we have to open our heart to hear this. I've been married to a beautiful Black woman for 38 years. And one of my struggles, I'll be very honest, was the loudest. My daughter and her friends were loud, and I struggled for this. But as it began to play out, every single member of my family has had a gun pulled on them by law enforcement. My oldest son was beat up quite badly once for no reason, right? And as these things play out, right, in the early stages, when we came to the United States, I'm trying to get everybody quiet, in my family. And I'm realizing that was wrong. It took me a while to say, wait a minute, what's wrong with being loud? What's wrong with, having a little movement in how you speak? And so to everybody out there who hasn't lived this, who experiences the African-American community from time to time, and it's, seems, loud, that was the best way to describe it. It's actually beautiful. It's wonderful. We lost my brother to alcohol and drugs. And we could not figure out in my community how to get our hands around family the way my wife did, the way my family could do it. And we lost my brother, but to this day, little farm ladies in Randolph County, where I'm from, will call my wife and say, my grandson's in trouble. My little wife, can you help me? The African American community has, in my humble estimation, this tremendous ability to get their hands around family and issues and problems. And we all can benefit dramatically from letting that flower and become a part of this country in the way it always has, but for us to accept it. There's so much beauty, there's so much opportunity that is laying out before us. This is a very amazing time, Reconstruction, there were good carpetbaggers, there were bad carpetbaggers. There are people coming to try to do things. After the Civil Rights Act, there were many of us who came, people like me, who came and wanted to do right. And here we have this time again. This is really a major, major time when the war on drugs and the war on crime are beginning to change. This data shows that. It's been placed out. But it's incumbent upon us not to become top down, not to think we have all the solutions, but to embrace this beautiful thing that is the African American community and all communities that have their own unique things to give to this country. So I will get off my soapbox, but I couldn't resist, talking about this thing and my own challenge. It was hard for me. That loudness was, my daughter was loud, very loud.
A lot of people commenting on this. Thank you, Reverend Gladden.
I just want to add, sorry, Jill.
No.
White people are loud.
Yeah. all women can be as loud as they want, someone said.
He is loud. My executive director, when we're in public spaces, I'm always like, okay, shh. She's a white woman, so yes.
A lot of it is driven by policies, and obviously we have a question, asking, what elected offices, we brought this up briefly, anyone can vote. What elected offices should we be looking at when we're looking at real change? We've seen here in the city in Indy that often, we try to make some policies and we're stymied. Where can people really, if they want to get involved, look to the offices? James, I saw you had your hand up.
This one is very dear to me. And this one, Rosie and I are hitting hard on, and I respect what she's going with Faith Indiana on this. We're going back and we keep arguing. Last year, we argued so hard at the mayor and the chief of police and all that great stuff. But I'm going to tell you what a very successful white legislator, Republican, stated to me. He said, you guys are protesting at the wrong place. He said, y'all got the wrong people. They follow our regulations, our laws. The state has control. Did you guys forget that? I said, I looked at him. And me, sometimes I can be a smart, but so I look, homie, I said, I'm coming for you. I'm coming to see you because I know where the root cause is. It starts with you. Greg stated earlier, there's a lot of policies and legislations created throughout the state from different parts. It's not Indianapolis, and it does affect Indianapolis. I see that. So if we start hitting hard at our legislators, we have changed the whole dynamic. In other words, again, we will go back to still dealing with change and evolution. We changed the whole aspect of what we want Indiana to look like and be. This is not the 20th century no more. We're not riding horse and buggies. We got to catch up here. And we're in a perspective that we really need to push for strong catch up. The work that Rosie's doing is the beginning of that evolution. It's the first part to continue to see things move forward, not just for Blacks, whites, but for everybody throughout the state that are in poverty and that are suffering and trying to get ahead. We hit hard on legislative, our House and our Senate. We take care of it all. That's where it's at. The mayor, small piece. Chief police, small piece. Governor and all the rest of them, got to go.
Rosie?
Yeah, so James is right. So while we've done a great job focusing on our local work, and we've got a lot done in Marion County, what ends up happening is that the State House, they'll try to take away a lot of the work. Ban the box. They try to take away our work on transit. They try to take the work away that I discussed about the Go Board, right? And we knew that was going to happen. So we have built this structure in Marion County where we've built this political power base in Marion County But now we have to do that at a state level. And so we have to be able to go from county to county that have some of the population that are with us, but are just not spoken to. There's a myth that when everyone hears the people hear white people, but the trends are changing. That's actually not true. Black people live in rural areas, and we have to start talking to them. And going back to what I said earlier, we have to start talking to them about what they care about. And we have to stop having this transactional relationship with people where we go and we talk to them for a voter season and we get them to go vote for us, and then that's it, right? How do we build transformational relationships that we're staying in constant conversation with, to develop, to lead in a way that makes changes to the community that they want to see, right? They may not care, not necessarily care, it may not be a priority to them that the Kroger's in their community has a parking lot full of trash. They're like, you know what, that sucks, but that's not what's important to me. What I care about is that when I walk outside my door and I walk my dog, or I get juice, or my son is walking to school, they won't be killed. So talk to them about what they care about, not just about what's a priority for you.
So opening that conversation, we've had a number of questions about, someone says, I just moved into a neighborhood on the Near East Side. We know a lot of change happening on the Near East Side right now. They want to get to know their neighbors, help with stability, but are aware that, they may be displacing people, and how can questions about, how can people, get involved in a meaningful way? It's difficult. There's lots of community centers and organizations that you can go to, but it may not feel like you're really making a difference, becoming involved, hitting the issues that matter. Reverend?
Yeah, so actually that particular attendee asked for a book recommendation, and I'd like to offer former Indianapolis resident, dear colleague, Pastor Mike Mather, the work that he and Diamond Harges have done. But the book is Having Nothing, Possessing Everything, Finding Abundance, and I forget the subtitle, but Having Nothing, Possessing Everything is a book that may be helpful to talk about the role of gentrification in the criminal justice reform conversation. Is probably a much longer conversation than we actually have for today. But I would certainly encourage you as a new resident to get to know your older residents and to perhaps not see them as challenges or problems if they tend their yard differently than you would hope that they would. Perhaps they are older members of your community in terms of elderly, and they could use some help with tending a yard in the way that the community that is building around it seems to think is acceptable or most appealing for a curb appeal. But go to the neighborhood association meetings. We do still have neighborhood associations that are very active many times throughout Marion County. It is not a difficult space to get into, and don't go to try to run the association, but go to see what they're already doing and to be in conversation and ask with courageous conversational character or charisma, but also with intention to understand that these people have been here much longer than you. And so now as a newbie, be a welcoming neighbor and go and get to know how things have been before trying to invite things to be something different.
Listen. The report builds off of some work that shows that Indianapolis is right at the bottom when it comes to income, opportunity, and equality. And Greg, I know that, that's the core of the work that you do, giving people hope in jobs. We are trying to, do more of that. And as it relates to this pipeline, it seems like such a really critical part of the puzzle. Good jobs. How can more people, become involved in this work?
Wow. Well, certainly gentrification plays a big role in when we finally start getting something happen in the community. the jobs shift, the housing, comes in, where the factory was before it gets moved. So, kind of slowing down development, that's a hard thing to say sometimes, but to give people a chance to catch up in a neighborhood, so they can own the homes. There's a lot of out-of-state landlords that we've got to work on some legislation to how those houses are bought. But, one of the things that certainly recycle force is an employment social enterprise. Goodwill is one. There's just Project Leah on the east side. As we begin to look at, the social enterprise movement, where businesses are coming into communities that have not just shareholders and profit as their motivation. Obviously, we don't want to lose money, but we also want to be able to have this social impact. So I really think that it's this third rail, because we've always had, capitalism and the job market and economic development growth, or we've had charity. The social enterprise movement, or the idea of an employment social enterprise movement, or a third rail, can really begin to play important development activities. Wisconsin's got a huge social enterprise movement. Toronto's got them. Indianapolis, we're young in this movement, but we can really begin to grow.
Yeah, we're scratching the surface there, I know, in a number of different neighborhoods. One neighborhood undergoing a lot of change right now would be the Twin Air neighborhood. Josh asked, the new community justice center, that's kind of the goal, is as just a different approach is the goal. Obviously we're not open yet. We don't know what's going to happen, but he asked, we've seen the new community justice campus trying to incorporate a lot of these solutions that we've discussed. Rosie, I know you've done a lot of work in this realm. Do you agree? The AIC is open and running now and hoping to double capacity soon. Do you agree that this is a good step forward?
Absolutely. And I'm going to do a shameless plug. It was because of our organizing.
Thank you.
That was possible. No. So, and not only that, when they were building, when they were trying to build a new jail, like we fought really hard that, okay, build the new jail because it's unsafe for like police officers and the people that are in the jail, but don't add additional beds. In fact, we want you to take away beds. And that's exactly what they did. And then they built the AIC to address, like once MCAT finds the people that are mentally dealing with mental illness and dealing with addiction, where do they go? And so that was what the AIC is for. And now we're working with them to make, because it's not just what oftentimes happens in organizing is they win the policy, but then they fail on the part of implementation. And so organizing is not just about let's win the policy. Now we got to work alongside them to help them with implementation and make sure they're staying on track, right? And so that's where we're at right now, is helping to make sure that we get the right people who needs the beds the most into that center.
James, do you have hope for this new campus coming to Indianapolis?
I do. I do. And the whole piece to everything, again, is not just bringing basic programming, but making sure the programs are effective. And we're looking again at the root cause. In other words, we just keep cycling through things, right? And we don't want to keep cycling through. And so the work that Rosie has done for some time with Faith in Indiana to make that happen, this is just the beginning of a new development, again, evolution. So we want to continue to move forward. But in part, we can't depend on the justice system to do our work. That's where we all come in at, right? And so the justice system will only do the scratch of the surface work. We are more entwined and more intricate with them because they release back into our neighborhoods. They are our family, our friends, and so on and so forth. That work must continue on as we continue to develop the ones that we love and care about.
We have a question about, how, if someone could speak to the conflict resolution skills that are being taught in schools and the community with the adults and families that are trying to address violence in communities. I don't have a lot of expertise on what's happening in the schools, but Reverend Shonda, maybe you have some insight into that work as it relates to you.
I really wish I did have more insight in terms of the conflict resolution skills. I know in my son's school, they are teaching the kind of social emotional skills for self-discipline, as well as to be self-aware in all settings and in all scenarios, with as well as the mental health and growth of the child, the whole child. From a young age up until adulthood, and knowing what the body is and is not capable of at certain ages. Those are the kinds of lessons that I see my son's school teaching, but I don't have a lot of expertise in this particular area.
Unfortunate that, some of those social emotional skills are under attack in places. But I might ask you to expound on the importance of the trauma-informed care piece. It seems to me.
If I could just say real quick,
Please,
that we have a really good organization in Indianapolis called the Peace Learning Center that works on that effort. So I just want to throw them out. They're real leaders in this conflict resolution work in the schools. So I wanted to get that out there.
And I have some experience in that area as well, because I work on education outside of faith in Indiana. And one of those things that I have been advocating for is like restorative justice. And as he said, the Peace Learning Center has some of that. Our schools actually, particularly in Marion County, are not doing the best in this area, if I'm honest. Like one of the schools that I had my daughter enrolled in had a zero tolerance policy that caused her to get like suspended all the time. And what really ends up happening in those moments, including when she was in IPS, that was the same thing. And then when we finally had a conversation about, so a kid cusses in school, the answer for us is to say, that is like, you're suspended, you can't keep cussing. When adults curse all the time, I know I curse, and I'm working on that. The point is that, we curse. The conversation is not about stop cursing. The conversation is about how do we code switch and how do we have the best language in certain settings, right? How do we make sure that if we're in a professional setting, such as a school setting, that's probably not the appropriate place to be cursing. So let's talk about that. Versus like, let's suspend you and talk about it in a negative way. It's just a word, right? It's just a word that was created. I mean, it's not the end of the world, right? And so, so having those conversations and more schools adopting that, honestly, I don't believe, unless it's an immediate danger of themselves and to other people, there's no need to suspend even kids who had a fight. I honestly don't believe they need to be suspended. There was a study done in California about most of the kids that were suspended in that area, in those schools, I forgot what area in California, actually were not related to the safety of the school. They were just suspended for other things, like being tardy to school. So those students actually did worse in their education because they were suspended out of the school. And so what you want is a model of like, let's have a conversation. What could we learn? And as Reverend Gladys said, talk about the emotional skills, emotional social skills, not just for the student, but actually also for the parents. That is actually really hard. I have a child who's very emotional a lot of the times, and it's stressful and difficult. And I actually had to learn the skills to deal with her emotional needs. And it's stressful on a parent to deal with children and their emotional needs. And so they need support as well.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jake.
To kind of comment off of that, I really jump in on this one because that's a really good piece when we talk about conflict resolution. What we're seeing right now, I'm not just looking at it just from the school standpoint, because the question was asked for the school and the community, right? And so let's go back looking at it from both sides. From a school standpoint, there's not too many schools that's teaching conflict resolution by any means, and they still telling the young people, go out there and figure out the best way you can. I can't figure out if I'm emotionally, started and going through a lot of things and stressors at home in my community. If there's people in play to teach me how to balance what's going on. And again, looking at that root cause. If you look at the conflict, right? Right, in resolution, you're going to look at the root causes. Why am I angry? How do I deal with situations? How do I interact in proper form of communications? It's not happening. That's one. And so that does need to happen. Warren Township, you speak on Warren Township and the data talking about the second, I think it's number 2 highest suspension. My son ain't even 8 years old, and that man is getting suspended left and right because they are not sitting there talking to him at all. The teacher, when she speaks to me, she speaks so condescendingly and put the fault back at home instead of sit down and trying to find a solution. And so I'm the conflict resolutor in both pieces, both for the school and my child. Just imagine many other parents is going through it as well. And so that needs to happen in all schools, strong conflict resolution. Let's jump in from the community. Community, whew, this is a tight one. If you rob me, Jill, you cannot come to me and say, hey, let's talk about this. Let's talk about how you put that gun on me, put me in the trunk of my car and took everything from me. Because the reality is we got to look at the issues again and say, hey, now there's certain situations that if I drive my car and I actually hit the back of Rosie's car, Rosie come out upset and mad, she could be having a bad day. How do I intervene and interact with that? Hey, Rosie, my apologies. I didn't mean to hit you. Our soft approaches, right? That's not being taught directly in the community. I know they have the mediation center, the James Waters Mediation Center, which I think is phenomenal for the individuals to go to. But the likelihood for somebody in the neighborhood to go into the mediation center, you won't have a high number of homicides right now if it was really, really popular. We have to teach that directly in our communities, working with organizations, looking at conflict resolution from all angles, not just from the adults, but from the child. We need to handle it and develop it directly ourselves because it's more penetratively focused and developmental at the community, right? The wraparound approach that Reverend Gladden was talking about, that love and that family, that village, comes in and build it together.
Yeah, you mentioned, that someone might not be aware of the mediation center or a myriad of other resources that might be available to them. Someone writes, they have a family member who's a prosecutor, often sees in the system that people need these resources, not incarceration. Again, all of the roots need to be addressed. But when he works with the defense and the social work to locate those services, even those people aren't aware of where to make those connections. I know you all, touch this type of work. There's not enough beds. There's not enough mental health help. How can we get people the real help that they need?
Can I jump in real quick?
Please.
For anybody, I'm gonna keep it real with you. We got a $1.3 billion budget to spray happen. Right. It's the highest budget Indianapolis ever seen. We need to dump dollars, strong dollars, directly into the organizations, the community, and so on and so forth. Another thing that you really, really, really stay focused on is we talk about this village thing again, right? And this is so important. The grassroots are the beginning of the village. They're directly connected to the people. We need to start developing and building them. More dollars need to go directly towards the mental health, drug addiction, strong programs, not the basic, hey, pull you in and out, 72-hour hold and send you out. Programs that are really developing every step of the way. Like Rosie had somebody in her life, and when she turned 18, that was very important to help them step up the way.
Greg, how do people find these resources? How do they connect, make real connections?
Well, I think James said it very well. I was going to talk on restorative justice for a moment, that it is very, very hard to do. If I rob James and then I come back and say, I'm sorry, that's a hard thing for him to sit there and talk to me, right? But I think when we can see this population that have made mistakes, coming home and getting involved in work and community development and having jobs and things as simple as being in litter cleanup projects, in the city, so if I'd robbed James and he's seeing me get my life together, it might help him open up this opportunity way down the road to say, you know what, Greg, I'm willing to sit here and talk. We watch it happen in our program all the time. I see people come in, I shot you. Yeah, you shot me, you did. Here's the scar right here. And how we get, there's been enough time that people have been down for a minute where you can begin to build these bridges, but it's a really hard thing to do in real time. And so I just want to throw that out there. I come up with the Quaker community, and this idea of restorative justice is a big part of our world, but it's hard, very, very hard to do. So
really hard work.
Yeah, but we need more of it, and we need it at the grassroots level, and we need the community leaders to be able to get out there and build these bridges. So when the time is right, we can make these connections and repair the damage that has been caused by crime.
Yeah, and we're facing a lot of crisis right now. And we're actually going to wrap today. I thank you all for such an amazing discussion. I mean, your insight today is hugely valuable as we really consider, again, place and the entire pipeline. I know we talked a lot about, school to prison in the past, but this is really, cradle to prison and the whole person. So Rosie Bryan, Faith in Indiana, leader and community organizer, thank you. Reverend Shonda Nicole Gladden, CEO of Good to the Soul. Greg Kiesling, founder and CEO of Recycle Force. And James Wilson, founder and CEO of Circle Up Indy. Thank you so much for the discussion today.
Thank you, Jill, for your leadership and your moderation and the courage.
Thank you.
Well said, well said. And to my fellow panelists, I'm honored to be here with you. Thank you.
And thank you everyone that submitted questions and was a part of this this conversation. We're going to now hand it over to Sharon Candris, who of course is an associate. Sorry, Sharon, I've got your associate director. That's right, of the Polis Center. Sharon, thank you so much for having this discussion today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. Especially Jill, I appreciate your conversation, or you're facilitating this important conversation. It was really insightful. And Rebecca and Eric, I appreciate the great presentation you gave this morning to kick off this important conversation. And a panelist, really appreciate you sharing openly your lived experiences, as well as inspiring others through programs that have proven effective and your ideas and recommendations. So thank you all for the great work today. The WFYI team, Polis Center really values you, and this rich conversation wouldn't be possible without your leadership and partnership, so thank you. And Savvy Talks, of course, wouldn't be possible without support from our funders, including the United Way of Central Indiana, Marion County Public Health Department, IUPUI, and Lilly Endowment. I do want to point you to the slide and let you know that the content today, including the slides, the report, which you may find interesting to read and dig deeper, as well as a recording of the event today, will be available on the Savvy website at that link. We apologize for the technical glitch that happened that prevented you all from seeing the final 4 or 5 slides. So you can get those slides online though. Also want to highlight an event that's coming up this evening. The Polis Center is going to be launching, well, I should say a series of partners are going to be launching the Digital Encyclopedia of Indianapolis. And hopefully you'll take some time to check that out. We have several civic partners, including the Indianapolis Public Library and several other important community institutions. You can check out the Savvy Equity and Data Information Hub. There we have other reports and data and information that will help shed a light on some of this other, all these topics today, but as well some of these related and interconnected topics that relate to equity and disparities in Indianapolis. And of course, you can visit the WFYI website for more information about some great programming that they have related to that as well. I do want to take one moment just to acknowledge and thank one of our colleagues that's worked with us for the past 4 years. Unai Miguel Andres is one of our research analysts that's been with the Polis Center for the past 4 years. You see him often on these events, and if you've attended any of our training and workshops, you've often most likely run into Unai. He's been a great value and asset to our team. He's going to be working with one of our partners at the School of Medicine starting in December. So we wish him well, and thank you, Unai, for all the great work that you've contributed to Savvy and informing our communities. And best of luck in your new role. So thank you all for attending, really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you at our next event. And we'll be looking forward to sharing with you our topics soon for the next year. Have a great day, everyone.